The first thing here that we're looking at is really having to do with the servants. And here in verse 35 it says, "Let your waist be dressed and your lamps burning." The Believer's Bible Commentary says, in Eastern lands, a belt was drawn around the waist to hold up the long flowing garments when a person was about to walk quickly or run. The girded waist speaks of a mission to be accomplished, and the burning lamp suggests a testimony to be maintained. So we can kind of picture that. Imagine yourself wearing this long robe. You've got activity to do. You've got work to do. How can you work like that? So what they would do is they would take that and kind of pick it up and stick it through your belt. So you'd be essentially then wearing a pair of pants so that you would be able to work. That's what it's talking about. So, and essentially be dressed to work. Have your jeans on. Be ready to get out there and do the work of the kingdom. That's what it's talking about. And your lamps burning. Well, the book of Revelation shows the lamps to be our testimony in the world. Yeshua said, "You're the light of the world." So that means being out there living it, right? Letting your light shine in the world. And this is how we're ready. Doing these things, working for the kingdom and letting our light shine. And of course, that means that we are allowing His Spirit to flow through us. We are being changed more and more into His image, and we are doing His will in the world. So that's not too hard to understand. And really that kind of goes along with the rest of what he has to say. It goes on here and it says, "Be like men watching for their master when he returns from the marriage feast, that when he comes and knocks, they may immediately open to him." Well, this is kind of interesting because, in a lot of his parables, he talks about being the bridegroom returning for the wedding. That's not what he's talking about here. So it's a little confusing. He's still talking about a wedding, a marriage feast. He's not saying that he is the bridegroom, but he's returning from the marriage feast. And when he comes and knocks, his servants are to be ready to open to him. Now, this is very interesting, I think, prophetically, because while the marriage of the Lamb happens at his return, this isn't talking about that. So what marriage feast happens before the return of Messiah that he could be returning from at his coming? Is there any such marriage? Well, when you look in the commentaries, they tell you, well, this just doesn't mean anything. This marriage just doesn't mean anything. I've never seen Yeshua say anything that doesn't mean anything. Have you? I think it's just because, frankly, the Christian world has been so ignorant of the prophecies that they don't know there's another wedding that happens before Messiah comes. And that's the wedding he's talking about. This is the marriage of the remnant of the 12 tribes of Israel to Yahweh that occurs at the second Exodus. Do you know about that wedding? It's very interesting here. We have a quote from Flavius Josephus in the first century. And this is what he says: "Wherefore there are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, while the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now, and are an immense multitude, and not to be estimated by numbers." So what this tells us is that in the first century, the Jews realized that they weren't all of the tribes. They realized that the Jews in Judea represented essentially 2 of the tribes, which would be, by the way, Judah and Levi. The other 10 tribes were scattered beyond the Euphrates, it says, so essentially out to the rest of the world. And that's what happened to Israel, scattered out there. And so when we see the Jews today regathered into the land of Israel, we're not seeing all of Israel gathered into the land of Israel. We're seeing basically the same ones, or descendants of the same ones, that were in Judea in the first century. These other tribes have not yet come back, but we know the scriptures prophesy for us that in the last days that would happen. And here's some verses we should look at. This is in Hosea. Yahweh says, "Therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her, as in the day when she came up out of the land of Egypt." He's talking about his bride, the nation of Israel, that he wooed as he brought her up out of the land of Egypt in the Exodus. But he's not talking about that time, he's talking about a future time. He says, "It will be in that day," says Yahweh, "that you will call me my husband, and no longer call me my master. For I will take away the names of the Baals out of her mouth, and they will no longer be mentioned by name. In that day I will make a covenant with them. I will betroth you to me forever. Yes, I will betroth you to me in righteousness, in justice, in loving kindness, and in compassion. I will even betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know Yahweh." Is this not a marriage? This is the marriage of Yeshua Messiah to his wife, the returning remnant of Israel, reestablishing his marriage covenant. And you would see, if you looked into Hosea more, he had cast off and divorced those tribes. But they had a change of heart. They will have a change of heart and come back to him. And this is all foretold for the last days. Here's some more. This is from Isaiah 62, and he's speaking again to the remnant nation. "You shall no more be termed forsaken, neither shall your land anymore be termed desolate, but you should be called Hephzibah, and your land Beulah, which means married. For Yahweh delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a virgin, so your sons shall marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so your Elohim will rejoice over you. So there's a lot of ways here in which marriage is in view for the returning nation of Israel in the last days. And none of this is referring to Yeshua returning for his bride at the end. This is what happens before that. So when we look at that verse again, and he says, be like men watching for their master when he returns from the marriage feast, should not his disciples know what marriage feast that is? Should they not understand that that is the returning remnant of Israel from the tribes? So that should make sense to them, even if it doesn't make sense to modern Christians who don't understand these facts. This is why, when he comes, they may immediately open to him. Because he's mentioning the marriage feast because it is a timing clue for the remnant. In other words, Messiah's return happens after the remarriage of Israel to Elohim. After that happens, very soon thereafter, Messiah is going to return. So they can be ready to immediately open the door to him because they will know, well, this other event has happened and now Messiah is coming immediately after that. I need to be ready to open the door at his coming. So kind of an interesting thing to look at. And then he says, blessed are those servants whom the master will find watching when he comes. Well, those are going to be the people that understand what's going on, right? Those would be the servants that he's talking about. And so that has to be the remnant of Israel and the great multitude from all the nations that join themselves to them, as we find it in Revelation chapter 7. And then it says, most certainly I tell you that he will dress himself and make them recline and will come and serve them. I don't think I could hardly stand that, could you? Can you imagine that? They will be blessed if he comes in the second or third watch and finds them so. The darkness of the night. It will be the darkest this world has ever been when he returns. And yet they will be ready. Then we have these verses. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what hour the thief was coming, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, be ready also. So what exactly is Yeshua saying here? He's saying that the master of the house needs to know the hour. Isn't he saying that? The master of the household needs to know the hour so he can be ready for the thief. And then he says to his servants, therefore, be ready also. Isn't he saying you need to know the time? The true servants will know the time. And then he says, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour that you don't expect him. In other words, he's not saying you as my servants are not going to know the hour. He's saying it's an hour that will be unexpected. people wouldn't think he's going to come at this time, and yet he is going to come at this time. That's what he's saying. But this was sufficiently confusing to Peter that Peter said, hey, wait a minute, Lord, are you talking to us or are you talking to them? He kind of lost his way a little bit. He wasn't sure whether Messiah was still talking to the believers or whether he was talking to the general population that wouldn't know. In other words, he's saying, is this for us, your true servants, who will know when you're going to come, or is it for the world who won't know? What are you saying? Well, actually, Messiah is talking to both of them. But his answer to Peter, I think, is very interesting. He answers Peter with a question. Peter asked him a question, who is this for? And Yeshua asked Peter a question, who then is the faithful and wise steward? In other words, if Peter can answer that question, then his question is answered. Right? Who then is the faithful and wise steward? So we can look at this simply as a parable, and this faithful and wise steward can be any faithful steward. However, in this context, where Yeshua is answering this question, who is the faithful and wise steward? Essentially, Yeshua is asking Peter a Bible question he should know the answer to, just like with the marriage. Peter should know what marriage that must be that the master would be returning from. And Yeshua is saying, you should know who this is, the faithful and wise servant. And then he goes on talking about the faithful and wise servant. He says, who then is the faithful and wise steward, whom his master will set over his household, to give them their portion of food at the right time? Well, that's quite an interesting question, isn't it? It begs the question, in fact, what is a faithful servant placed over a household? And you could also ask the question, how many of them are there in a given household? Well, we have this verse from Hebrews. It says, Moses indeed was faithful in all his house as a servant, for a testimony of those things which were afterward to be spoken. But Messiah is faithful as a son over his house, whose house we are. And if we hold fast our confidence and the glorying of our hope firm to the end. So, we have the example of Moses as a faithful steward over Elohim's house. But then, of course, this particular section of Scripture is saying that we have something better in Messiah, who is appointed as Yahweh's son over the house. However, if he's the son, in the context of these parables, is he not the master of the house? And as the master of the house, can he not do exactly what it says here? Set a faithful and wise steward over his household. His right-hand man to do what? To do what? Well, to give them their portion of food at the right time. All of this is about time, isn't it? Everything we're reading here is about time. At a certain given point in time, before Yeshua's coming, he is directly telling us he is going to set a faithful and wise steward over his household to give his household their food at the right time. Do you think you could use that? Getting that food at the right time. Do you think that could help you to be ready? Can you see why Messiah would talk about this? You know, this is talking about something hugely different than the situation that most all believers today are used to. In the example that we find in Hebrews, we have Moses over the household of Yahweh. And we had centralized leadership over the whole nation. And through Moses, Yahweh expanded that, established judges, established elders throughout his nation, and set everything into order. And that's what made it possible for the nation to leave Egypt at all. If they didn't have that central leadership, how could they as a nation have come together as one nation and been able to head out of Egypt? We're talking about national leadership. This is not shocking. Every nation today has a leader. Name one. Name one nation. They all have a leader. They all have a government. They all have an order of how they do things in their nation. So, if we're going to have this wedding of the returning remnant of Israel, does there not need to be a new kind of government that hasn't existed over the people of God in a long time? It's so easy just to read right over this when Yeshua is saying that he's going to set over his household a faithful and wise steward to give out their portions of food at the right time. He is talking about government, isn't he? It's included right here in the parable. He's telling us there's going to be a change of government that's going to happen. There's going to be an appointment that's going to happen. The nation's going to be organized. You're not going to have to worry. You're not out there all by yourself, because this food at the right time is going to come to you. That's what he's saying. That is such a radical idea that people can read right through this and not even actually hear what this verse is actually saying. Now, this is not actually radical if we think in terms of the first century, because remember, this applies to the first century too. Isn't that how it was for the believers in the first century? How many denominations of messianics were there in the first century among the first century believers? One. Yeshua Messiah, before he ascended, set a faithful and wise steward over his house, which, by the way, is the house of David. And he put a Davidic representative in that position, which was his brother James. And James was a steward over that house. Now, does that mean he did it all by himself? Of course not. It's a nation. And just as there were 12 tribal heads, well, there were the 12 apostles. Just as there were the 70 elders under Moses, under David, later on, there were 70 elders. Do you think if that was true in these two other times, that when Yahweh reassembles his nation, that wouldn't be true again? That's his way of working. Well, what a test this is, because here's the thing. Some people will have a heart to welcome Yahweh's order, but a lot of people are kind of used to flying by the seat of their pants. And they're not really going to like Yahweh's order because they want to kind of do things their own way or build their own kingdom or whatever it is. And that's part of the warning here that Messiah is giving. So I think this is kind of an interesting look at things. Well, if you were Peter and you were going to go on what you had already from the scriptures and what Messiah had already said to you, and Messiah asked you, who then is the faithful and wise steward that will be appointed in the last days over the house of Elohim? What would you think of? Would any verses come to your mind? How about the last book before the age in which Messiah returned, the book of Malachi, where Yahweh says, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and terrible day of the Lord? Do you think that might enter your mind? What about what you saw on the mountain when they asked Messiah, is this true? Is Elijah going to come first? And he said, Elijah will come first and will restore all things. All what things? If you were familiar with the Jewish sources, you would already know the answer to that. All things are the 12 tribes of Israel and the order of the 12 tribes of Israel. You see, these things were known to his disciples, but they are mysteries to Christians today, and yet you find these things very clearly right in the pages of the scriptures. Blessed is that servant whom his master will find doing so when he comes. Truly I tell you that he will set him over all that he has. Certainly this too is a message for every servant during this time. We all want to be faithful and wise servants in the household of our master because we want that reward in the kingdom. We all want to be a part of that. And it's worth it. You know, it's really worth it to put our whole life into that goal. Well, let's see what else we've got here. Now, it's talking about another servant here. And it's also, after this, talking about another servant. And each of these is calling that servant. So it's a little confusing in English. Sometimes we're thinking it's all talking about the same servant, but it isn't. It's talking about, in the Greek, it has this meaning besides that of other. So an other that. In other words, another servant. But anyway, it says, if that servant says in his heart, my master delays his coming, and begins to beat the men servants and maid servants, and to eat and drink, and to be drunken, then the master of that servant will come in a day when he isn't expecting him, and in an hour that he doesn't know, and will cut him in two and place his portion with the unfaithful. Now, I'll tell you exactly who I think that is. I think that's the apostate church. That's who I think that is. You know, they had set certain dates for the master to return, and he didn't. The error was theirs, not his, because they have misinterpreted the scripture. But nevertheless, he has not returned, and time has been moving on. And we are seeing the apostasy in the church deepen more and more, and we're seeing more and more spiritual abuse, as Michael pointed out, and such as these verses talk about. And in the end, it's not really going to be a good thing, because what they're expecting to have happen isn't going to happen. There will be no pre-tribulation rapture. So, you know, all their timing cues are wrong. They're not going to understand the times, the people that stick with that. And unfortunately, it's going to lead to a result where they are exposed as not being the faithful servants, with all the results that we can expect to come to that. And how could we expect anything else from the church? There's some wonderful people still in the Christian church, and we love those people. The time will come when they will have the opportunity, if they haven't done it already, to come out of the church. They will be invited to. They will see great signs and miracles that should encourage them to come forward. And so by the time these events happen, every person in the church will have an opportunity to see what the truth is and respond. But many will not, because many are not a part of the church because of any love for Messiah, but for other reasons. A lot of them because they enjoy abusing their position and what they get out of that. So this is just a fact. So it's very interesting to see how Messiah could see ahead and see that this very situation would be in evidence. And the scriptures, of course, tell us very much about this apostasy that we see happening. It's pretty amazing. Now we have another that servant who knew his master's will and didn't prepare nor do what he wanted, will be beaten with many stripes. This, I think, in some way for our group, and I don't just mean here, I mean all of the remnant believers, this is probably the scariest part of all of this, because it's talking about those who knew the master's will, people who understood the truth for these final days, yet didn't prepare, didn't do what he wanted. Why would anybody do that? Why would you come to know what the truth is and then just decide to go your own way and not prepare, not do what Messiah wants? It's very simple. You've got your own agenda. You've got things you want. And that's more important to you. You know, we've had people who have investigated this truth about the last days and all of these prophecies, and have come to believe it and told us they've come to believe it. And then, you know, would some of them say to us, in view of the shortness of the time, I have things I want to get done before my life is over here. I've always wanted to have such and such a house. I've always wanted to have such and such a marriage made. I've always wanted to do this, want to do that. I need to go and do those things. To me, that's an unimaginable response of people to the truth. But unfortunately, it's very real. A lot of people are really like this. They want to do their own will rather than his will. You know, right now is when Yahweh's people need the help, right? This is when we need people to come and join with us and put their shoulder to the plow with the rest of us. And yet we have these people like I'm talking about, and for them, they say, well, this has got to be party time for me, and I'll come in later after I do all the stuff that I want to do. I'm thinking that plan probably isn't going to work out about later. Just saying. It says that people like that will be beaten with many stripes. Ouch. But he who didn't know and did things worthy of stripes will be beaten with few stripes. You know, we've got a lot of people out there that are just out to lunch. Maybe they love God, but they don't really have a clue what's going on. So they're not doing the stuff that they ought to do. They're not going to have as heavy a judgment as those people who know what the truth is, know what needs to be done, and won't do it. That's what Messiah is telling us. To whomever much is given, of him will much be required, and to whom much was entrusted, of him more will be asked. Now, there's more than one way to react to this. One way to react to this is, well, if much is given to me, and that means much will be required of me, then don't give it to me. That's what some people would say. They'd rather not have the responsibility. But is that really how we should think about the things that the Master wants to give to us? Is he wanting to give you anything that you can't handle with his help? Isn't he competent? You know, he's the king of this nation. Isn't he competent to know what you can do and can't do? Is he going to give you something you can't do with his help? And if you do it, what's going to happen? If you do what he entrusts you to do, he's going to bless you beyond what you can ever imagine. You know the main thing that he asks of us? Show up. If you show up, he'll show up and do his part. And his part is 99.9% of the whole, right? This is my little secret of what I do. I determined to do one thing. That's all I promise. I'm going to show up. And when I show up, you know what happens? He shows up. So no matter what happens, that's what I do. And he always shows up. So it's not that hard, really, you know, to be a faithful servant. to do the things that he would entrust to you? Not really. Just show up. And, take that step to do what he's got for you to do, and he's with you, and he will help you do it. But being a servant of Messiah is not for timid people. If you're afraid to risk something, if you're afraid to risk, I might look bad if I do that, that's not an attitude that will help you as a servant of Messiah. You've got to be a person who's willing to risk something. You've got to be a person who's willing to take that step, to show up, to see what he's going to do when you take that step. And, when you do that, it is amazing what you can see him do. It is absolutely amazing what you can see him do. Let's be bold. Let's be bold. Let's take those steps and see our Father work. Division. Do you think division is a last days issue? It has been an issue for believers in every age. But I think especially in the last days. Who is the divisive party? Is it the believer or is it the other folks? Well, let's say you've been going to Christmas with all of your family for the last 25 years. And Yahweh brings you to a place where you realize, this is really based on a pagan holiday. And you feel you can't really keep doing that anymore. So you call up your family members and you say, you know what? I'm not going to be coming to Christmas this year. But I'm thinking of visiting at a different time, such and such a time. I hope everybody's well, yada, yada, yada. Are you the source of division? If your family loves you, should they not honor your decision? Why is that so hard? Yet, what happens for many people in that situation is everybody starts jumping on the believer, right? Oh, you're such a fanatic. You're a part of a cult. You're this, you're that, you're the other thing. What is really the source of the division? They don't like the truth. This is why division has to happen, doesn't it? Because a lot of people, unfortunately people we love, are resistant to the truth for personal reasons. And they don't want to make it their fault, so it's got to be your fault. Does that put pressure on you? It does. Most of us love our family. We love our friends. That kind of personal pressure can be very powerful. And yet, what is at stake here in these last days? Don't you think there's a reason why this is mentioned here, talking about these last days circumstances? There's a place of safety being prepared for the remnant in these last days. And it's going to come to them as a result of the remnant exodus that is a few years away. On that day, there's a lot of people that will be thinking about whether or not they're going to heed the call and to come along in the second Exodus. I can tell you right now that there will be many who will not come because someone in their family is refusing to go. And they just can't leave such and such a person. When should we think about this? When that happens? When should we think about the question, who is the most important person to me in this universe? Oh, it's my dog Spot. It's my Aunt Bertha. Really? Something to think about. And then, of course, we have the signs. The people knew the signs in the sky of the weather. They didn't have an app. So they looked up at the sky and they could tell from the sky what was going to happen with the weather. And Yeshua said, you know how to interpret the appearance of the earth and sky, but how is it that you don't interpret this time? Can you imagine these people who are watching Messiah? There's a great multitude there. They've seen him cast out demons. They've seen him heal the sick, so many different things, even raise the dead. They don't get it that Messiah is here? What about the signs of the times today? Do you see the signs of the times? To me, the signs of the times are screaming at me. Absolutely screaming at me. The volume is so high, you know, like every day, there's just so much happening that are fulfilling the signs of the times. And yet some people say, well, I don't really know if these are the last days. And I look at them and I wonder, you know, like, what planet do you come from? Don't you see what's really going on? Look at the war that is happening between the globalists and the nationalists. What are they fighting that war about? The real thing they're fighting the war about is getting to the one world government. The globalists are winning, by the way. They're getting some resistance, but they're winning. This is huge. So much going on. So much happening. Showing that we are indeed in that final generation. So then we have finally the parable of the judge. This is really good advice, by the way, for anybody who's potentially looking at court. So settle up before you get to court, basically. Do that. Courts are not just, for the most part. Worldly courts are not just. So if you can settle it up before you get into court, by all means, do exactly what Messiah is saying right here. But of course, that's not really why he's saying it. He's saying it because the idea is head off a potential catastrophe by acting soon, quickly. If we see the signs of the times, if we see how quickly things are moving, if we know from the prophetic picture what is going to be happening, we should know that when it is time for the remnant exodus, we need to be a part of it. We should know that. The people who are acting early, just like Messiah is talking about here. They're getting out of the way of the Antichrist. They're putting themselves outside of his reach, outside of his grasp. Once he's in power, you can't do that anymore. It's too late to get out beyond his grasp. So then, you're just looking at being faithful to death then. That's basically what you're looking at. You can have a better outcome than that if you act sooner. Very simple. Very simple. Well, these are indeed sober things that Messiah is talking about. But don't you think that these are things that can help us make good decisions? Don't you think understanding these things can help us make the right decisions? Because, I'll tell you what, most of us are procrastinators, aren't we? When it comes to unpleasant things, we like to kind of push them down the road. Oh, I'll deal with that later. And all of this argues for us against behaving like that. That the sooner we can act, the sooner we can get ourselves into that position as his faithful servants, walking with him, extracting ourselves from the world, being ready for what he has in mind for us, the better the outcome will be for us. And this is really what he's trying to help us with. And I think that's a very positive thing, that he wants to help us be ready. And we want to help you be ready too. Just a few comments about our mission. We know that out there in the world, you've got a lot of things that are vying for your time. We understand that's difficult, dealing with work, taking care of your family, all of the things that you have to deal with. And yet, week by week, we have our action points. We publish them in our newsletter. We also have them on our website where we're saying, do this little list of things. And over the course of a week, it might take you a few hours to listen to each of those things or to do each of those things, perhaps to do the Torah quizzes. And as you do those things, it helps to build this foundation in your life that is going to help you to do these things, to be a faithful servant that Messiah is talking about here. And I just want to thank all of you who are diligent about doing those things, because you're doing what is good. You're doing what is good for yourself. You're doing what is good for the kingdom. And I know some are having a harder time with doing those things, in many cases for very legitimate reasons. But I just want to encourage everyone, take the time to do those things as a minimum in order to keep up each week with what's going on. Because talking about proper food at the right time, that's what this is. It is food at the right time. And if you keep taking this in a systematic way, it's going to build you up and keep you strong and help you get through this. Once in a while, when we're busy, we might miss a meal. Ever been so busy you missed a meal? That happens sometimes. But what happens if you do that all the time? You're not going to be healthy. So, we have these meals for you on a regular basis. Show up and take them in, okay? Because it will bless your life.
For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. The apostles, they were Torah scholars. This is why I'm doing Tsiyon Academy. The lessons include 2-hour audio programs and quiz modules. All the lessons in the Torah can be applied to us today. Not to mention, they open up the renewed covenant scriptures in a whole new level, much like the apostles had understanding of the Torah. Plus, I can do the courses in my own time, at my own pace with no prerequisites, and at a very low cost. I can do them here. Or here.
Tsiyon Academy students are provided with study materials, the Tsiyon Messianic Scriptures, in-depth verse-by-verse programs, and quizzes with your final grade and a certificate at the end of the course. Tsiyon Academy also offers assignments for students who would like to opt in to take part in the Tsiyon Tabernacle live Shabbat meetings. Become immersed in the Torah. Find out how you can become a Tsiyon Academy student at tsiyon.org.
Was this video informative? Remember to hit the like button to help spread the word, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notifications button so you'll get updates on all the great content coming from Eliyahu Ben David.